Hi there. This is help with 7.3 complex numbers. All right, the title kind of says it all. It's just a bunch of complex numbers mixed in here. Really what that means is that you have one fraction involved inside of another fraction. So in this first example, I just wanted to try something with numbers. If you look at this, if you have a 4/9 that you're trying to divide by an 8/5, we don't ever take fractions and divide by other fractions. We instead change that. Instead of dividing by an 8/5, you bring it up here and multiply by the reciprocal, 5/8. And then you're just looking like what we had done previously, where you're multiplying two fractions together. So you look to reduce. This 4 would reduce with this 8. And so then I end up with a 5/18. And that's what that simplifies to. So we're going to have that same strategy even when we throw variables in there. We're not going to divide by fractions. We're going to come up here and multiply by reciprocals. So in this next example, it looks a lot messier, but the idea is the same. I'm going to bring this denominator up and multiply by the reciprocal. So I'm going to write this a little bit bigger here. I have an x plus 5 over a 6x. And instead of dividing, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. So now my 5x squared is going to be on top, and my 4x minus 5 is on the bottom. And then your goal is to kind of do any sort of reducing that you possibly can with that once you've flipped it. All right, so when I look at it, remember you can only cross things off that are being multiplied. So this x plus 5, I don't get to separate that x and 5. It's its own thing. This 4x minus 5 is its own thing because of the minus sign. Now sometimes we look to do some factoring there, but there's no GCF that's going to come out of either one of those. There's nothing that can be done. So when I look at this, the only thing that I really see that I can reduce are these x's here. Now the 6, remember, is being multiplied by the x. The 5 is multiplied by the x squared. So you're allowed to reduce with that multiplication because you can kind of separate out the factors. In this case, the 5 and 6 are going to stay there, but if you've got an x squared on the top, that's like an x times x, and you have an x on the bottom. Well, this one here could cross off with one of the ones that's right here. And so now what I have is this one on the bottom is gone, and I just have one of the x's on top, and then I just write what's left. I'm going to have the 5. I usually like to put my monomial terms in front, so I'm going to have my 5 and my x to the first power, and then I have my x plus 5 in parentheses. On the bottom, I'm going to have my 6, and then I'm going to have my binomial 4x minus 5. And you're done. You've crossed off and reduced what you can. You leave the rest sitting there. All right, let's try one more. Actually, let me go back here and notice on this one, what's important on both of these examples that I did is that you have one fraction on top of another fraction, and this is just a single term right here. This is a single term. Same thing here. This is just one fraction divided by one fraction. This next example, they kind of separate it up. This is not really one fraction. I have a number here that I'm adding to this fraction. And that whole idea of multiplying by the reciprocal only works if it's like one single term. These are two separate terms. So to work through this, the first thing you're going to want to do is change these 3's and put them over 1. And then you have basically two fractions, and you need to add those together to make one big fraction and do the same thing on the bottom. All right, so if I look at these two fractions, I'm adding, so I need a common denominator. I have this 1 and this x, so my common denominator is just going to be an x, so this side I'm going to take times x. So then that ends up being a 3x plus 5 all over that common denominator of x. On the bottom, my common denominator is going to be an x squared. So I take this side over here times x squared. And so I'm going to end up with a 3x squared minus 5 over the common denominator of x squared. Now, it looks messy still, but what we do have is this is now just one fraction on top of one fraction. And so now I'm going to bring this up here and multiply by the reciprocal. So I have an x squared on the top, and on the bottom I have my 3x squared minus 5. and then we look to do any reducing that we can. So right here, there's no GCF that can come out of that, and so with that plus sign, it's all tied together. Same thing down here on the bottom, I've got a minus sign, there's no GCF to pull out, so it's its own thing. The only thing that I'm going to be allowed to reduce on this is this x with this x squared. So this x will reduce, this will become an x to the first power. And then so you write it, I like to put that monomial first, so the x will be in front, and then the 3x plus 5. And on the bottom, this x went away. Remember, we're supposed to be putting a 1 there in its place, so I just basically have this quantity left, 3x squared minus 5. And I'm done. All right, good luck with that.